So welcome, Sebastian. Sebastian Buckup, you are the director of the program of the World Economic Forum. So there is something that people don't know about it, which is the process of building this program. And before we dive into what you found interesting this year, I'd like you to tell us about the process, because Davos is actually really trying to represent society, and so you have different committees representing different parts of society. Just like in a few minutes, walk us through the process so that people realize it's not random. It's not coming just out of the blue.
Yeah, happy to do that, and thank you for hosting me here tonight. Actually, the way I got to know Laurent is that I participated in one of his LIFT conferences, but we didn't meet there. We met much later in a spaghetti bar somewhere in OV. So the process, how is Davos being built? I think what's really important, maybe sometimes it helps to start from the end and then go into the process. We are bringing 3,000 people to this event, roughly. So it's actually like they're much bigger conferences. You just spoke to me about one. But of course, the kind of people are quite extraordinary. But what I find more extraordinary is that more than half, so more than 1,500 of those are really taking active roles in the program. So in that regard, it's not a conference where you go and you have a couple of speakers who are presenting something. It's really a collaborative effort where a big part of the group is participating. And I think that's a good segue into describing the process, because the annual meeting at Davos is just, I would say, one stop in a year-long engagement where many of these people in different committees are coming together. So the World Economic Forum has, on the one hand, a small event group, but the majority of people are actually working in more, I would say, like an incubating function, or like a secretariat for public-private partnerships. We are championing, we are sponsoring public-private partnerships in all kinds of domain areas. We are creating steering committees, steering boards around them that are oftentimes multi-stakeholder, so business, civil society, and public sector. And they're doing work on a year-long basis.
Just to tell you,
but they're coming together then in Davos.
I met Sebastian because I'm working on this book about events, and I tried to get an interview with him. And I said, I'm very interested in your conference. And they felt offended that I thought Davos was a conference. And so for 1 year, they rejected me. And when I finally met, not him directly, but his team, I finally met him. I was like, why did it take so long? He's like, because we think it's not relevant. We are not a conference. Yeah. And so to the world, we see the World Economic Forum through the lens of Davos. But you are actually a think tank, you are a place where there's year-long discussion, and Davos is a highlight of the calendar, but not the only thing.
Yeah, exactly. And you have, I would say, in Davos, you have the highest level of these organizations meet. So oftentimes you have, like on an EVP or on a VP level, people engage in these projects year-long. But then in Davos, you have the CEOs and the heads of state and head of government get together. So this is, in a way, sort of the main strategic body of what's happening on a year-long basis.
And so you, the idea behind Davos is that there are three forces shaping society: civil society, business, and NGOs or not-for-profit sector, or
that's civil society, right?
Yeah.
Civil society, business, and then government.
Yeah, exactly. So you have three forces: civil society, business, and government, and
they
each have a committee. Mm-hmm. And each committee says, this is what we think we need to talk about. Yeah. And then there is a whole a consolidation process that happens. And this is where your team comes into play, and you kind of see what they find interesting, and then you translate that into a program. Very summarized.
Yes and no. I think there's one other element that is important to consider, is because the World Economic Forum is not a treaty-based organization like the UN organizations. So there is not really a formal consultation process and a formal decision-making process, which is an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time, because of course it raises questions around the legitimacy of the forum and why we choose certain topics over other topics. But the advantage of it is that it is not bureaucracy. It is more an entrepreneurial organization. I mean, in spirit, it's founder-led still. Klaus Schwab, who started it in the age of 31 or 32, I believe, in 1971. He's still our chairman. So many of the initiatives and ideas are being generated by entrepreneurial people inside the organizations and then tested with our stakeholder groups. So that's, I think, the difference between UN organizations where I worked as well, where you really have the governing bodies, where the nation states are saying, okay, we want to do this, and then the secretariat is carrying it out. I mean, it's a very stylized way of putting it. Whereas I would say at the forum, you have lots of initiative also being generated from the inside and then tested.
And then one last idea on the process, and then we talk about the content. I found very interesting that for you, ideas have different stages. Like at first, you identify them as a topic that need to be explored, and then they become topics that have been segregated. Like this is really something that we need to talk about, and so you make a whole part of the program and you take people together. And then the third stage is like we need to do something about it, and that becomes projects.
Yeah.
So it's like we evaluate a topic, then if it makes the cut, it becomes a center of interest, then it becomes action and projects.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's more or less the way of thinking. There's sort of the value chain, if you like. It's also part of the history of the forum. When we started in the 1970s, it was a conference indeed. In the 1980s, we added a second layer, which was the community layer. So as of the 1980s, if you wanted to participate in the forum, you had to be a member of it. So this is where we started with this dimension. Then in the 1990s, we started with all these knowledge products that some of you might know, our work on gender, our work on competitiveness, and so on. And then I would say in the early 2000s, in the heydays of global governance, where everyone thought that nation states are not important anymore, we need to have a new form of global governance, the forum really jumped into that and said, okay, let's think about like cross-border, cross-sector ways of governing globalization. And that's why I find it really interesting to be now at the forum, because that kind of thinking is experiencing a huge backlash at the moment. It's very much back to nation states. And it's a very interesting point for the forum as well, to find its purpose and to find, okay, what's our role in that context.
And so let's move on to this year's program. So the main title is Globalization 4.0.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about the general theme, and then we're going to dive into the different, more precise topics. So what is Globalization 4.0? Why is it the theme, and what is it?
Well, I would say those, and all of us do that, who are following the news will have the sense of there being a backlash to globalization, particularly driven by the nation that has actually created and led the international organizations that made globalization possible. First, the Bretton Woods organizations, I would say until the end of the Cold War, and still the Bretton Woods organizations after, but then really emboldened with the WTO and so on and so forth. So now this hegemon, this leader, is taking a very different stance. And of course, it's an important moment to ask, okay, what is globalization about? Is there actually going to be another phase? And how should this phase look? So in a nutshell, globalization 1.0 is more or less the kind of globalization that we saw 100 years ago in the Victorian age. It came to a brutal hold with the First and the Second World War, the Great Depression. Then there was another phase of, I would say, economic expansion after the Second World War, the golden age in Europe and the United States, to some extent how it's being described. And then you had a third period, which was, in terms of quantity but also quality, very different after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And that, to some extent, people would say came to an end. You can say with the financial crisis or with the election of Donald Trump, to some extent with what's happening in the UK. But also being challenged not by these geopolitical developments, but also by a rapid acceleration of technological change. And that's what we want to look at, the combination of geopolitical tensions, technological change, the environmental costs of the past period of globalization, and then lastly, the impact of inequality in many nation states, which is also, many would argue, a result of globalization. So we look at these four drivers and say, well, things are really not going in the right direction, but there are also interesting innovations that could create a new form of globalization. And what is this new form? And that's what we want to shape.
It's so 4.0 doesn't imply that it's better than 3.0, right? It's like a new phase. Doesn't mean it's better. In technology, usually the new version is better, but what you're saying is that not necessarily better. And also, I think what's interesting, I mean, being French, and you have this, French have a very weird look at things, but you have this idea that Davos is this very, right-leaning organization who's promoting blind capitalism. And I looked at the program, and so, as you said, you have this global theme that then is applied in different dimensions. So geopolitics, You want to discuss a multi-conceptual world, peace and reconciliation. Economy, fourth industrial revolution, stability of financial and monetary systems. Technology, policy and industry systems, inside which I believe you find automation, blockchain, etc. Cybersecurity, resilience to risks. That's the fourth topic. Human capital, new societal narrative, less focused on moving away from consumption and materialism to a more humanistic focus, which I think people, if people were reading your program, they would have maybe a different view on what Davos is. But there's really some very, very strong statements. And the last one is institutional reform and economic cooperation, all these being traversed by global warming as a main issue. So this is very different from the image that the forum has. And you guys really go into very, very deep topics. So maybe a good way would be to dive into the first one, geopolitics, multi-conceptual world, peace and reconciliation. Like, why is it on your agenda, and what are the ideas you found interesting? What are the key messages that are going to be discussed in Davos this year?
Mm-hmm. Maybe on your introductory remarks, it's actually interesting indeed how the World Economic Forum is perceived. I would say that our founder has a very strong, I would say he's a social market. He takes a social view on market economies, and he always has. But at the same time, the World Economic Forum is a mirror of what is happening in the world. And that I find really interesting. Kissinger, who comes to the forum quite often, he was sort of a mentor for Klaus Schwab. Klaus Schwab went to study with Kissinger in Harvard before creating the World Economic Forum. Of course, also a controversial figure, said that we always talk about sort of the tension between realism and idealism. But then he said, okay, this tension doesn't really exist. You have to see the world how it is to be able to take it where it has not yet been. And the World Economic Forum is exactly that. It's a reflection of how the world is. When Donald Trump is the president of the United States, he's going to be there. Theresa May next week is going to be there. Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil, he's going to be there. And I'm getting a lot of questions. How can you invite Jair Bolsonaro? He's a very right-leaning politician. And I would say that this is the realist side of the World Economic Forum. It's reflecting what's actually happening in the world. But then there's a program. There are people who actually have the idealist role in the forum to say, okay, where would we like it to be? And that's the big collaborative process.
It's a fine balance, because you're clearly trying to take the world, I mean, these are very strong statements. You move away from consumption matter to more humanistic. So at the same time, you're trying to take society towards a certain direction. And at the same time, you must work with what you get and not being too judgmental about it. And you told me something also when we prepared, which is that at the forum, you invite the function. You invite the President of the United States. You don't invite Donald Trump. Yeah. And so in a way, there's a lot of people who define who you're going to have to work with on a yearly basis, and you try to be a bit like the ICRC. You try to be neutral and say, we're going to talk to everyone, because if you've been elected, we have to deal with you.
Yeah, exactly. That's the principle of the forum, which is sometimes painful, because people who have a certain function are going for very long, and then they're like, why am I not invited anymore? And then it's like, yeah, well, you're inviting the function. On your first question, peace and reconciliation, it's a topic that hasn't been that prominent on the forum agenda, maybe in the public perception in recent years, but it has always been there. And I think that's a really interesting one, because the World Economic Forum has always has had quite an important role in the Middle East peace process. So not very successful, but the World Economic Forum has very good, because of the economic foundation that it has, right? It has a very strong relationship with Israel, but it has also a very strong relationship with the Saudis, and a very strong relationship with the Jordanians. So actually all these different fractions that in certain areas don't agree with each other, all agree when it comes to market and when it comes to business. So they all come to the World Economic Forum, and the World Economic Forum has been a platform, because it is called economic, for track 2 and track 3 kind of diplomacy, where these people then in a private environment would actually talk about more geopolitical topics. But we're taking this now a little bit more to the front.
But is it on the topic because you're worried about that? Or you say it's been there all the time. I mean, but there's some voices say, we're going towards maybe some like global conflict. You see definitely the rise of nationalism and more tension. Is it something that you bring back on top of the agenda because you're worried?
Well, there are two dimensions to it. Yes, we are worried. Very clearly, the World Economic Forum is built on the belief that it is better if people do business with each other and compete at that level, rather than competing in terms of arms investments and other kinds of zero-sum competitions. So this is I would say, a prerequisite, sort of a foundational belief of the World Economic Forum. And in that regard, it has always engaged in conflict areas, has looked into fragile states, because when there's fragility, it's very difficult to even start talking about development or even talk about growth. So it has always been a topic in that regard. I would say the dimension that has been added this year in particular is not the peace and reconciliation piece. Yes, we're going to talk about Libya, we're going to talk about Syria, we're going to talk about Venezuela, but it is the rise of economic nationalism, which is something that has been very, very strong and very impactful. It already has an impact on global growth, and that's a topic that we try to address.
And what is a multi-conceptual world? What do you mean by that?
I would love to understand that as well. We're also very good at buzzwords and jargon. So multi-conceptual world, I would say, is a play with the world, multipolar world. You could say multipolar means that people might have similar ideas of how the world should work and of how the world works, but they have like power and they have different interests and they're competing with each other and they might not like each other and they try to win over each other. In a multi-conceptual world, you have less of a commonality because you have like fundamentally different understandings of how an economy should work. If you take the bureaucratic capitalism in China versus the more sort of free market capitalism in Anglo-Saxon countries versus the kind of capitalism that you see in Russia and other parts of the world. So, and that also happens on different levels. So I would say that's the idea.
So what you say is that
means different ideas, not just
exactly
different
what
interests.
defines not maybe like physical frontiers, but more like ways of thinking or technologies. And so, I mean, we see definitely that there are different ways of conceptualizing the world, as you say, are competing. Fourth industrial revolution, policy and industry system. I mean, all this seems to contain a bit all the discussion right now about, for example, automation, the possible disappearance of work, which I personally don't believe in. But so, what are you going to talk about here? What are the hot topics when it comes to this transition? I mean, fourth industrial revolution is another buzzword that your chairman came up with. I said it, you didn't say it. Do know for the no, don't say that, Mr. Chairman. No, but it's this idea that the digital technologies brought a new paradigm and allows us to do new things and create also new issues. So what is on your radar for this topic, the new ways of organizing work and what policymakers can do about it?
So indeed, the fourth industrial revolution is a narrative that's been created by the World Economic Forum. I think it's probably the most, maybe after the idea of a multi-stakeholder world, what we just started with, it's probably the single most successful narrative of the World Economic Forum. If you would have Googled fourth industrial revolution 3 years ago, you wouldn't have found much in Google. If you Google it now, it opens up a world. You have countries around the world to name ministries after this term. It's insane. It's an example of a narrative that we've been able to create and that now is taking on a life of its own. It has become part of our organizational structure. We have opened FOIA offices in San Francisco, Tokyo, Beijing, Mumbai, and there are 12 more locations to come. So it's been also the basis for the expansion of the forum. Why? Because it's a topic that is of equal importance for governments and for business. What are the topics? For instance, artificial intelligence, huge topic, all the way from what can it do to how are biases embedded in this, of programmers in San Francisco or elsewhere. Autonomous vehicles, a huge topic. Globalization is about ultimately the acceleration of people and things, and autonomous transportation is going to play a role in this. I think what's original about the fourth industrial revolution narrative is that it's also touching upon the overlap of digital innovation and biological innovation. So there is a big department in precision medicine that we open up in San Francisco. And when it comes to international relations, not many people are thinking about it. So these are really, I think, early topics that we are incubating and that are already on our agenda, but are going to be big on the agenda in 2, 3, 4 years from now. So these are like a couple of areas, but there are.
So just to go back a little bit to the process, I mean, using an anecdote, but we bumped into each other by chance in Beijing in March last year or something. And you were here because you have teams that basically scout a country like China for the best ideas. And then you come for 1 week and you meet the cream of the top of the best ideas and entrepreneurs and people. And then you decide if they make it to the main program. And so there, typically, you were telling me you saw some incredible startups that had growth that are absolutely crazy on models, business model, technological models that we cannot even start imagining here. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about, startups or ideas typical of this fourth industrial revolution that you spotted in China?
I mean,
but you told me about
China
these YouTubers, for example, YouTubers that had like hundreds of millions of followers and would create these like gigantic studios and then become brands, etc.
Well, China has this interesting, like when you take the media world, China has this very interesting ecosystem of what they call grassroots celebrities. And on the different social media platforms, these people get millions and millions of followers. It is a way, it's a form of influencer hype that we see in other parts of the world as well. But just because China is such a big country, it is just going to very different dimensions. So there's a woman, her name is Papi Jian, who I believe you then met in China as well, who is in a way a comedian, normal, very approachable person, doing very funny videos, but then also addressing issues in China related to gender expectations of women versus men in China and so on. So really interesting. Other areas that are, of course, and many of you will have read about this, absolutely fascinating in China is the whole like payment system world, which is far from what you see in the US, but also in Switzerland. Switzerland is actually more advanced than the US, but still.
We shouldn't be too proud of just being more advanced than the second to last.
I'm paying my bus ticket with
advanced.
Twint now.
Yeah. You still don't have to put your PIN in the US. And it's less secure than everywhere. Yeah. But for example,
China is. We have just. One example that has generated a lot of news and that is going to be discussed in Davos as well. China has actually announced. One researcher in China announced a couple of weeks ago that they had the first CRISPR baby.
And that is you have to explain CRISPR.
CRISPR is a new gene editing technology that allows you to really, in a very precise way, add and subtract in the DNA. And China, and there are of course huge ethical questions around this, which are holding back very innovative countries such as Switzerland, of course, in biotech. But then you have a country like China where you don't have these regulations, where you actually don't have an individualistic culture or value system, and more sort of a group value system which lets people also think very differently about optimization of DNA and optimization of humans. That's why a lot of the research and the technology development in that domain is happening in China. And there are big discussions, of course, about like how can we make sure in other countries of the world that we don't fall behind, but at the same time respect these rules.
It's a good example of what you were
saying. That's a big topic.
It's a good example of multi-conceptual worlds. Like there's a totally different value system, and we can judge it, but it's here and it has some advantages and disadvantages, and it's hard to like ignore it or lecture it. They definitely do things right. Another big topic is cybersecurity, risk resilience. That's a massive topic we saw with the election issues that impacts you directly. So tell us a little bit about that. It's becoming one. I was with Yves D'accord actually of ICRC, and it's like most of the war right now is happening in the cyber world.
I think there's an interesting evolution of how we think and talk about security, because technological change has always changed how we think about architecture, infrastructure, and security, right? Until 150 years ago, people would build walls around their cities. Then you had modern artillery and aerial bombardment, and since then we don't have walls around our cities anymore because they just are useless. And I think the same is now the case for cyber, where we talk about information that is passing through any wall. And more and more corporations are realizing this. The World Economic Forum had made a big investment to open up a cyber center next to the 4IR center, and really now tackles this now front and center. And we look at cyber crime, we look at but also cyber warfare. So we basically look at the more economic dimension of it and the geopolitical dimension of it as well.
And so to you now, it's a massive topic. It deserves to be one of the 6 main topics.
Well, it is from a geopolitical point of view, it is a war that is not going to happen at some point, but it's a war that's already happening.
How do you approach that at the forum? Like, what is it? You build a panel with like Putin and Trump, and you tell them, hey, what about the last election? Like, show us your Facebook account, Vladimir. No, but what do you discuss? Because definitely it's a very, very touchy subject. And like, do you try to train your attendees on how to better protect themselves? Do you talk about it like in a theoretical way, like somebody explains what's really happening? I'm curious, like, it's such a sensible topic, and you actually have the players who are here in a suit, but they're actually fighting with each other in a way. So how do you deal with this?
Well, everything that happens in Davos has, I would say, a public component to it and a private component to it. The public component to it is about awareness raising. So this is where we very consciously draw the media to it. We try to build a good narrative. We try to get this out. We could try to get the narrative out so that people actually are aware of it. And then there is a community, there's a private component where people actually get together in a more intimate environment and have an opportunity to also between parties that are competitors in other fields.
And this is actually a public part. Like anybody can go to Davos actually and hang out in the city, and you bump into.
Oh yeah, but when I say everywhere. Public, there's like two publics, right? There is.
No, exactly. I was just saying, people imagine that the city is locked and you cannot move. No, you can actually go to Davos and spend some time in the streets, and there's going to be people with badges, and they are the attendees of Davos. It's not like a fortress that is totally closed.
But ultimately what the forum can do. So, I mean, we are based on the network. So if we bring together big corporations that all have this challenge, what can the forum do? It can really tap into this network, can collect information from all the different corporations, say, okay, this is a shared concern, and just extract best practices and share them. So much of the work is going to be on that, really working with companies, trying to identify what works, trying to come up with rule books, suggestions, playbooks, and that's one part of the equation.
Offensive or defensive best practices, like this workshop, how to screw the elections of your neighbor country. No.
I don't think it goes into that. I don't think it goes into that
no, of course.
Direction.
So the next one is human capital, this new social narrative, move away from consumption material to a more humanistic focus. Yeah. So why is it important? That's probably the most connected to global warming.
Yeah, I mean, and I find, you said you don't really believe in that happening, and I'm on the fence as well, right? This scared narrative around, okay, we're all going to lose our jobs, and first it was blue collar that is disrupted, now it's
talking about automation of
exactly, automation of work. I would say there are probably, there are a couple of dimensions to that. One dimension is to really understand what is happening, what kind of jobs are being disrupted, but also what kind of jobs are being created. There are lots of conversations about what kind of skills and what kind of competencies will be needed in 10 years from now versus like 10 years ago, and how can countries prepare for these skills. Then you will have also conversations around, okay, what is it that actually makes us human versus what is it that can be replaced by computers? And many people would say it's much easier to replace a surgeon with a computer than a nurse. So that's where this question is coming from about like, well, how could a sharing and caring economy look like where many of the more intellectual tasks are actually being automated? So those are some of the...
And typically this is the kind of debate where all the actors are at Davos because you have the Google and Facebook of this world, and you also have all the governments, and so it makes sense to put them together. But also the second part of this topic is the move away from consumption and materialism to a more humanistic focus. So that's what is going to be discussed there, and how do you sell that to some of these large companies who maybe are trying to pull the world in a different direction?
Well, I
mean they're not the only members.
Well, I mean, there are questions, of course, around our obsession with labor in general. I mean, we have a culture where labor, having a job, a paid job, is sort of part of your identity. So I think there are more fundamental questions around our value system and the importance that we assign to labor. So you had, I think, Keynes already in the 1920s say that, well, in the 2000s, people will exactly work 3 hours per day because they don't need to work more because of technology. But that didn't happen. It's one of the few predictions that he made that really didn't happen. People actually even more working, right? So I think there's a fair question around, well, more and more value is being generated by capital. More labor could be idle because of that. Does that mean that we need to force ourselves to create some sort of jobs? And you have people like David Graeber who say that the majority of jobs that we actually have are so-called bullshit jobs that are just there for the sake of being there and for keeping us peaceful and not killing each other. Or is there a society that we could imagine where we redistribute income that is mostly generated by capital in a fair way that allows us to do the kind of things that we actually enjoy doing? So we do have these fundamental, luckily, some of these fundamental conversations in Davos. And there you have the conversations around basic income and so on. And many experiments are actually run in Switzerland. Yeah. Sometimes
and that's all it can be at this point. It has to be a conversation because there is no solution, because we need to figure out the future and build it. So it's all it can be. It cannot be like a training. It has to be a conversation, because it's still like topics that need to define themselves. The last one is institutional reform and economic cooperation. So this is where you move the program more towards like maybe knowledge sharing, best practices sharing among governments, and try to think like what is the right governance model to handle the world as it is.
Well, you have two levels. I think there's a very nice term called institutional architecture. Actually, everyone focuses on globalization 4.0 for this Davos, but the second part of the theme is shaping a new global architecture. And I really like this idea of architecture because it goes into this area of institutional reform. You can look at it on a corporate level, of course. You have many wonderful stories where you have companies. Sony came up with the first digital music player, but they never managed to scale it, right? You have Xerox, who came up, of course, famously with a mouse and never was able to scale it. So you have many of these examples where you didn't lack smart people, but you lacked a smart infrastructure for these people to scale their ideas. And that was my experience going, and I shouldn't do UN bashing, but that was my experience working at the United Nations. You have many smart people. You have many people who are attracted by the mission of the United Nations, go there at an early age to work there, and then are disillusioned. Why? Because the architecture of this organization doesn't allow good ideas to scale. I mean, there is now interesting work happening. They are setting up labs. They are really, really trying, and there are good outcomes. But for me, that's exactly one of these examples. So when we talk about institutional reform, we do look at the kind of institutions that were built in the 1940s that were incredibly successful. I mean, the average age in 1944 was 48. Now it's on a global scale 72. One reason is that these organizations helped us live more peacefully with each other. But because these organizations created a world so different from the time when they were created, they are to some extent obsolete, or at least in need of reform, in need of a reform that is really about the architecture of it. And that's what we want to look at, not as a competitor of the UN, but as a partner, as another side of it. And we are working very closely with UN organizations, with the World Bank, with the IMF in that regard. So I would say that's the theme which is really going sort of closest to the heart of what this meeting is going to be about.
Yeah, I mean, it drives me to several things. One is in the tech world, where I spend a lot of time. Like you see that with the regulator being very late compared to the pace of innovation. That's a typical example of the architecture of society being inadequate to deal with some of the new issues that innovation brings. Mm-hmm. And you see two machines running at very different speed, and so that creates a lot of social issues. So I think that's a very important topic. I thank you for walking us through the program. You just saved me the membership to Davos, which I'm sure I cannot afford, and then like 4 nights at a very nice hotel in Davos, which might be even more expensive than the membership. So thank you very much, Sebastian, for sharing that with us. Thank you.